It's my pleasure now to announce my co-host this morning, Kelsey Meyer-Schockel. She is an executive coach, facilitator, sometimes professor, and an all-time mom. So Kelsey, please join me on the stage.
So Julie already mentioned Paul is on sabbatical, which is why I am right here. I think we look to Paul as an example. He's an inspiration, and he's someone that a lot of people in this room look up to. And so for him to value and prioritize taking time away, I think that sets a really great example and tone for all of us. With that, I have the privilege of transitioning us now to our speaker for today. Paul Hillen spent his first 15 years of his career at Procter & Gamble. He spent the next 15 years at Cargill. Paul was one of the earliest and fiercest supporters of the Good Leadership Breakfast. He was the person who got the breakfast its first ever corporate sponsorship through Cargill. And Paul stayed deeply involved with Good Leadership. In fact, he's Paul Botz's co-author on their upcoming book, Goodness Pays, which I think we're going to get to hear a little bit about today, Paul. So please join me in welcoming Paul Hillen.
Well, of course, Bots took off on us, right, Kelsey? So he, and Sean, where's your green? I mean, come on. I got my tie. I got my socks, okay? And my son works for Tommy John in Manhattan, so you can imagine the rest. I've got some shamrock, some other place. I won't go any farther than that, okay? So, yeah, well, we're recording this, and so that's a shout out. That's a little bit paid advertisement. I think Tommy John's got to get a spot up here. So I don't, for those of you who know me well, and I've been up here a few times, not as the speaker because I've turned Paul down as many times as he's asked. I don't usually use note cards, but Bot said 15 minutes or you're dead. Jerry Miola, who I'll talk about a little bit, who's helping us with the research, said, do not misquote the research. So I figure I better, if I don't write it down, I might, some of you know I'm a bit prone to embellish. So I want to make sure that I'm being honest with the research. So I'll be going back and forth on the note cards as well. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend, typically you guys are used to somebody coming up here and having a really great story and they've overcome some big thing. I'm just kind of an average guy. I don't have some great story of what I overcame, but I will tell you a little bit about, I'm going to try to spend about half of my time on a little bit of my background, and that'll just be context for the book and why Paul and I have come together to be co-authors, because I think it's important. Paul and I are two pretty different people, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we met, and I think why, as they say, opposites attract. I think why we've come together and are working on this book. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. I'll try to split it half and half. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm born and raised in Green Bay. Okay, that was a Gulf applause. So this is the time when you Viking fans, if you want to get up and go to the bathroom and sneak out, feel free. Okay, you can go to the bathroom or get some more coffee out there. So born and raised in Green Bay, youngest of 7. My mom had 7 kids in 9 years. So it was dog eat dog, right? I had a great childhood, but it was survival of the fittest. And I was the youngest, so I was always left behind. They tie a pork chop around my neck so the dog would play with me. I mean, just try to make sure that somebody was taking care of me there. So there was a lot going on in that house, obviously, and it was tough love. I mean, my parents believed in a strong education, Catholic faith, so I'm an Irish Catholic, half German, half Irish, so I don't know why I like beer. I had nothing to do with either of those two heritages. And, but believed in you make it your own way. And, it's a tough world out there, and you better know how to take care of yourself and look out for yourself. So I grew up with that. As the youngest of 7, I had 5 sisters, or as I like to say, 6 moms, okay? And 1 brother who's about 5.5 years older than I am. And, I remember a couple of stories just to give you an idea of the kind of the tough love and the make it out on your own. There was one time, I think I was 10 or 11, and my dad had me up. My dad always said, we're going to do this weekend. We're going to clean the garage. We're going to trim the trees. So this was trimming the trees. So I'm up 2 stories up in a tree, climbing up. I got 2 sharp implements in my hand, trying to cut off a branch. And I said, Dad, what? Can't we get help? Aren't there companies that do this? And he said, that's why I had 7 kids. If you fall out of the tree, I still got 6. I mean, you know, my dad believed in child labor. I don't know why people think that should be illegal. I mean, he believed in child labor. So another time when I was cutting the lawn and he came out, I couldn't get it started. And he came out and he got it started. And of course, when you get it started, you can't talk to each other. It's too loud. And he went in the house and I finished mowing the lawn. And I came in, I said, Dad, what was wrong with it? And he said, DAO error. DAO error. And he lowers the paper. He says, dumbass operator. And he winked and smiled, right? I mean, that was my dad. So, but the point was, you got to learn to figure stuff out for yourself. You know, don't ask others to do for you what you can do for yourself, and you got to figure stuff out. And so that was kind of the tough lug. We weren't, and it was hard. Kelsey and I have talked about this. It was hard coming to Minnesota because I think Minnesota is the land of 10,000 hugs, not 10,000 lakes. I didn't grow up in a hugger type family. My wife Karen, who's here today, I married into a hugger family. If you're going down the street to get the car washed, you hug and do that. So I've learned my way into the hugging culture, I should say. So I always had a job. You know, one of the things back to the Packers is at age 5, I said to my dad, you know, I really would like to start going to Packer games, get my own Packer tickets. And he said, no problem, I'll help you get them, but you got to pay for them. And I was lucky enough to have an older brother, so even to this day, always worked, always had jobs, and he had a paper route. So I started working for my brother at age 5. By age 7, I had enough to buy my tickets. And then I had my own business. I eventually took over his own paper route, I was always shoveling driveways, lawn mowing, all that kind of stuff. So it's always been kind of a grind for me. I think that's the easiest way to think of it is I'm more of a grinder than anything else. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I just try to hopefully outwork folks or work as hard as I possibly can. I mentioned Irish Catholic. So I went to St. Matthew's, which was a Catholic grade school, got a little bit of tough love there as well. Sister Carlotta, she had something she was wiry, tough, you know, one of those with huge biceps, but she weighed about 110 pounds. I'm not kidding you. She was a farm girl from Denmark, Wisconsin, and she had the janitor make what was called the Board of Education. And it was, if for any of you were in a sorority or fraternity in college, you know, the flat board with a handle on it, and she even had him drill holes through it so there was no wind resistance, right? Well, Tommy Jones and I were late for recess coming in, and we were saying, who can hit the school bell? That's when you had bells on the outside. Who can hit the bell first before we go in? Well, before we knew it, we were in Sister Carlotta's office, and we got 3 whacks from the Board of Education. Now, it took me 10 years to tell my dad because, as the old saying goes, he probably would have said 3 wasn't enough. You know, I'll give you 5 more. So then I went to an all-boys Catholic school in De Pere, Wisconsin, right next to Green Bay. For those of you who know St. Norbert College, they were the knights, we were the squires. So all-boys school, sport coat, tie, had a great time. But again, guys kind of go at each other, right? It's kind of a dog-eat-dog world, and everyone's, you know, giving each other jabs, and you got to look out for each other. I then went on to Marquette University, and I quickly learned, because I had to pay for my own college, how do I do this? How do I figure that out? And I wanted to combine my passions. Leadership, so I knew I wanted to be in some form of leadership. I knew I had to earn money. So I quickly figured out that, the head of the Inter-Residence Council at Marquette gets free room and board. Voila. Okay? Then I learned that the president of student government, free room and board and tuition. There you go. Then I did an internship with Miller Brewing Company, free beer. Did I mention I'm Irish and German? Did I mention passion, build your resume? No, literally the union had just negotiated a new contract where they used to be able to drink on the job, but instead every employee got 2 cases of beer a week. So I, of course, made friends with as many of the non-drinkers I could at Miller. So I used to load my Pinto with 10, 15 cases of beer strapped to the top. I was, you wonder how I got elected, right? That's how that worked out. And then I did an internship with IBM, and then as Kelsey said, I started with Procter & Gamble. Did 5 years of sales, 5 years of, 5 to 8 years of brand management, and then 2 years of general management where I ran the beverage business there. And I'll talk about that culture. Then I came over to Cargill and worked on the food strategy for about 1.5 years. Then I was a business unit leader there for a little bit over 6 years. And then ran the innovation portfolio for 3 at Cargill. And then, as Kelsey said, I was in charge of brand and marketing at Cargill for about the last 5 years. And then for the last year, I've been at Platinum Equity, which is a private equity firm that owns about 42 companies out on the West Coast. They're in Los Angeles. I still live here in Minneapolis, but do a lot of traveling and helping them run a couple of companies. So that's what I'm doing. So let me talk about the cultural shift, and I think this is really relevant to the book. And it'll be the precursor of how Paul Botz and I got together. So when I came from P&G, it was a perfect fit. It was kind of dog eat dog, promote from within. You either got promoted every 2 or 3 years or you were out. It was battle in the conference room. You'd go at it for an hour, make decisions, and then you'd go on to the next meeting and everything was cool. In fact, one of the things I didn't mention is I played 4 years of rugby when I was at Marquette. How many people in the room could come up here and explain rugby on a scale of 1 to 5? Who would be a 5? I got 1 in the back. 2. Okay. Who's a 1? Who knows nothing about rugby? Okay. So I'll just tell you 3 or 4 things you need to know. 80 minutes, 2 halves of 40 minutes, 80 minutes nonstop, no timeouts, no substitutions. Games are only canceled if the ball floats, if there's enough rain where the ball floats, and no excuses. Okay? So it kind of fit with my upbringing, and it was a perfect precursor to P&G. It was kind of eat or be eaten. It was publicly traded company, deliver the quarterly earnings. What have you done for me lately? You better come to every meeting and be wired and completely buttoned up. So then I moved over to Cargill. Got to be the same, right? $100 million company, just like P&G, about the same number of employees. Cargill has now about 150,000. P&G had about 120,000 at the time. Couldn't have been more polar opposite. Cargill, more familial, literally family-owned, privately held. More of a consensus building, kind of more of the Minnesota nice, a little more huggy, right? Little different. And more collegial, more consensus building than P&G. So everything that had helped me to be successful at P&G, where those were my strengths, became challenges. And I was getting stuff done, but at times I felt like John Belushi in Animal House, where he says, you know, we can't give up. Come on, when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor, and he runs out of the room, and he's like, hey, and he looks behind him, and no one's behind him. So I was pretty successful, and after about 1.5 years, I became part of a program called Future Focused Leaders at Cargill. They took 50 or 60 of the business unit leaders and functional leaders and put them through training. And part of that was you did 360-degree feedback, and everybody was given a coach. I was given a coach from MDA Consulting. After a week, she had to go on bed rest because she had a difficult pregnancy. MDA had nobody else. So who did I get? Paul Botz. So Botz was the president of MDA at the time, and he said, who else is going to do it? So he jumped in. So completely serendipitous that Paul and I now know each other. That was about 2004, so 14 years ago. And Paul first came in and he started talking to me about some of this stuff. I'm not sure he had the 7Fs completely wired or the 4 cornerstones of goodness. I was like, jeez, what is this fluffy, soft gobbledygook? I'm like, okay, I got to do it because I'm being told I have to do it by my CEO, but you got to be kidding me. Who is this guy? Wears bright clothes and shiny and he's optimistic all the time. I got dumbass operator going through my head. That's what, I mean, not about Paul, but just like, does this guy have any clue about how the world works? Okay? So, remember I said I'm not a hugger? Paul's a hugger. Okay? So, when opposites attract, and so we started working together, and I'll tell you, he started opening my eyes. And I had a choice that I either needed to, I had 2 choices. I could either change the way that I led and did my work at Cargill, or I could leave. Because my 360 degree was pretty good. He's competent, all those kinds of things. But does he really have our best interest in mind? Is he really empathetic? Or does he invite us to meetings to jam his ideas down our throats? And so Paul and I had that discussion, and Paul helped me through it. And the reason that I stayed and ended up spending 15 years at Cargill is it forced me to exercise new leadership muscles. I became a completely different leader and really balanced the two. And at one point, Paul went to my boss, John Geisler, and said, what happens if Hillen can't make this change? And Geisler said, well, then we might need to make a change. And then he went to Greg Page, our CEO, and said, what if Hillen doesn't make the change? And Greg said, well, what did John Geisler say? And he told him. And Greg said, you know, I don't see it that way. I think we have to help people like Paul Hillen to be successful at Cargill because we need to change as well. So it's kind of that meeting in the middle. So, you know, the whole mentor piece, both today, John and Greg, I consider to be very good friends and mentors of mine, and they coached me through it. Because Greg said to me, and this is something I'll always take with me, he said, you have to make sure if you're going to be a leader, people need to do things because of you, not in spite of you. And Geisler gave me the Teddy Roosevelt quote, I believe it was from Teddy Roosevelt, where he said, people don't care what you know until they know that you care, right? You've all heard that? And John gave me that, and those 2 things I will remember forever. So anyway, we came together, Paul and I, as we were working together, and I started changing my leadership style and bringing in some of these concepts that you guys hear Paul talk about every month in the Good Leadership. It was starting to work, and it was changing, and I was becoming much more effective. And that became the inspiration for the book, where Paul said, geez, you know, he almost said, if you can do it, if you can learn it, you know, you're a bag of hammers. I mean, how do I mold that? Then, geez, other people can do it, and clearly there are cultures out there and people making these same transitions. So that was the inspiration for it, and that's how I met Paul. So it really has become a great balance. And we said, so how do we help other people? And we were working at the time on the new brand positioning at Cargill, which was Thrive, about this whole idea of all of our stakeholders, including our employees, being successful and thriving. So that kind of became the impetus. How do we help leaders to be far better and to be good leaders, okay, in the context of goodness and in the context of better financial results? Because I said to Paul, I'll work with you to write this book, but it has to have a few things. First of all, no fluffy bullshit. It can't be BS. The concepts are good, but we have to prove it. And so the conditions are, one is we have to prove that goodness pays. And I'll talk about that here in a second. What we mean by that is that people that exhibit the behaviors of good leadership, 7Fs, 4 cornerstones, they get better financial results. that there's a correlation to better financial results. Had to be data-driven, and we needed to honor the skeptic. We knew there were more people. That's kind of my job, to be the skeptic. You know, is this really fluffy and soft? Or if I change my leadership style, and if I help my management team change their leadership style, then we're really going to get better financial results. Because in the end, it doesn't matter who you work for, even if you work for yourself, your job is to create better financial results and shareholder wealth, okay? We also said, does the world really need another leadership book, really? So this had to be different, okay? And so on the data-driven piece, then we went to Jerry Miola, SMS Research, who has helped us tremendously. And I only brought a small portion of the deck of data that I think this is a 70-page deck. I think we've got one that's a 115-page deck that Jerry and her staff have helped us with tremendously. So that's the data-driven part. We had 4 objectives. One is we had to prove that goodness pays. Does goodness really pay? Does it get the financial results? What does goodness mean to leaders? What does pays mean to leaders? And then here's kind of the money shot, because the other thing we said is this book has to be different. The world does not need yet one more leadership book. This has to be different. We are creating a goodness pays index. So some of you are familiar with the trust index from Edelman, the G12 from Gallup, net promoter score, right? You ask a few questions and you get it back. Well, similar type concept. The idea is that we create a simple tool called the Goodness Pays Index that folks can self-administer. And so that is going to be a big difference in there. One is the concept of goodness and that it leads to financial results, but then we correlate it to financial results. Our hypothesis was that good leaders thrive regardless of what the market conditions are. So we found a lot of leaders that even though their industries were down, were continuing to get good results, good financial results, because they exhibited these, these behaviors. So we did 3 things. And as you read through the book, you'll see this. We did 3 things around the research. One was a literature search. So we looked at all the other leadership books that are out there and said, how do we be different? And will we be different? Because if not, we were just going to kill it. 2 is we went out and we talked to 15 senior leaders who we knew had great financial results and were also considered to be good leaders. We talked to 15, 5 at large companies, 5 at medium-sized companies, 5 at small companies. For those of you involved in market research, you know you got to do qualitative to help you with the quantitative. And then we conducted 900 individual quantitative research to get the data to say, does it really correlate? Do these behaviors really correlate? So what we learned was there weren't a lot of books out there that were talking about goodness. Nobody had an index. So we said, you know what, we think we have something here. What we learned from the research, if you go back to our objectives, was goodness pays. So we've uncovered that those companies on the goodness index who score in the top box on a scale of 1 to 10, they get a 9 or a 10, over 50% of them had stronger financial results. If you take top 2 box, so they scored a 7, 8, 9, or 10, whether you're large, medium, or small, they all had over 90% correlation. 90%. So, you know, as Paul and I say, and we're going to write about this in the book, common sense, however, is not always common practice. Right? This is common sense, but why isn't it common practice? Why aren't goodness principles common practice? So that was what we learned. We also learned that the definition of goodness, so we said when you say your leader is proactively promoting goodness in the workplace, what does that mean? Here are the top 5 things. Team first. They're sincere. They're authentic. They're not saying what they think you want them to hear. They're empathetic. They'll walk a mile in your shoes. They spread positivity, and they're ethical. okay? The quantitative, when we also then talked about pays, what is definition of pays? So what does it actually mean to pay? Here's what they said, these four. Financial results, importantly, financial stability. Critical, right? If you're an employee, am I working for a company that's going to be around tomorrow? Or are they going to do another RIF and headcount reduction? Fourth, service. So almost paying it forward. So that was part of the pay. And then finally, around this ethical piece, that if my company's not ethical, what happens? Regulation comes down on me, fines come down on me. Okay, kind of a little bit of a twist, and that was one that we got. One of the leaders that we interviewed was Chris Policinski. He's the CEO of Land O'Lakes. And I think Jerry and I were in his office doing the interview. And he walked us through that, and he said, you know, if you speed often enough, you'll eventually get a ticket. And it's gonna cost you. And it's literally gonna cost you out of your pocket. So I thought that was an interesting twist there. And then as I mentioned, we've created the Goodness Pays Index, where it's gonna be a really simple tool that companies can self-administer and use it as a tool. And what you'll find in the book is you're gonna find the definition of goodness, the definition of pays, the data that shows the correlation to goodness pays index tool, and then finally, a suite of additional tools, 5 for sure, maybe even 6, that if you're scoring lower on the goodness pays index, what do you do? How do I change what I'm doing today to move there? So that's where we are. So my clock has clearly run out. In fact, I think they reset it twice. So as I said, I can't say hello in 15 minutes. So I clearly am there. So just to finish, where are we? Because some of you will say, well, where's the book? I thought I'd have one on every table. So we're in the process. We're talking to publishers right now. We're going back and forth with them. We expect about another 3 or 4 months back and forth with the publishers and the editors. I cannot end without some thank yous as well. So we expect, if our fingers are crossed, before the end of 2018 will be published, if not early 2019, is what the plan is. But in addition to Jerry and her group at SMS, Sean McDonnell, he's helping us as our writing coach, we'll say. So Sean is keeping Paul and me in check. And then I know if Melinda were here, Melinda Botts was here, Paul would definitely want to thank her for all the support. And I certainly want to thank my wife, Karen, for all the support, because we're still doing all of our day jobs and trying to write this book at the same time. And without that, there's no way. So anyway, I hope you learned a little bit. We're happy to answer any questions. And I think Kelsey and I are going to be up here for a little bit to do a little Q&A. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'd ask from a help standpoint going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah. So, Paul, thank you so much for what you had to say. I loved hearing, we got to talk a little bit before this morning, and I got to hear some of your journey and the work that you guys are doing on the book. I could ask, this is a problem, again, being a coach, I could ask 100 questions. So I tried to narrow into just a few. The first thing I want to ask you about is the book and the research. And I can imagine I'm not the only person in the room who's really excited to see where this goes. But could you just give us a little preview around, like, maybe 3 tips for leaders that are coming out of, as you're thinking about what you're seeing in the research, how we can be good leaders or how goodness pays?
Well, one of the things I didn't get to, and maybe I'll answer it this way, is what is the opposite? One of the things that, U.S. Bank is one of the sponsors, and so we talked to Richard Davis. He was one of the 5, and as the CEO of U.S. Bank, and he said, well, he was actually great with honoring the skeptic. He said, well, can the opposite be true? I mean, does badness, not pay? And Paul and I kind of thought about it, and we said, yeah, actually, we think badness doesn't pay. And so the definition of badness or not good in the research, there were a few things. So you asked for 3, I'll give you at least 2 here. One was the opposite of others focused. Those who are self-focused were not seen as good leaders. And so the opposite of being others focused, kind of the empathy piece of it. But or do you really have their success in mind? Are you really thinking about segmenting your employees to say, how do they define success, or do I really treat everybody the same? Do I manage everybody the same? Do I have the same employee benefits? All those kinds of things. So that's the first thing, is be others focused and don't be. The second was self-promoting. Taking credit for somebody else's work, right? It was all about them. Kind of self-focused or others-focused, opposite, but a little bit different twist on it, self-promoting. And then another one was fairness. And fairness wasn't the, am I being treated fairly? A lot of what we've talked about, and it's my definition of fairness as well. Are you decisive? Are you quick in making those decisions instead of kicking everything, down a week or two? Because there's nothing that's more unfair to an employee than letting them wallow around without making a decision. And then the other piece of it was, everybody knows when you've got an employee who's not pulling their weight. Being decisive in moving those people off your team. And they said when leaders don't do that, then they're not a good leader. Mm-hmm. So those are 2 or 3 I'd put out there that are also backed up in our research.
Yeah, I see that last one that you mentioned a lot in coaching conversations and how difficult that can be for the rest of the team. So Great, that's great, thank you. So on a slightly different note, I'd love to ask you a bit more about your learning experiences in your career. I loved this when we first met, and I loved hearing about it again today, that you had some kinks to iron out when you transitioned from P&G to Cargill. It was a learning opportunity. And I'd love to hear, now that you're in another transition into running a company that's owned by a PE firm, what sort of things are you learning now?
It's actually a great mix of the 2 cultures I talked about before. Because private equity is, because the whole idea is they buy a company and how do you flip it as fast as possible. So growth, growth, growth. What have you done for me lately? It's not even what are your earnings quarterly. It's literally weekly. Weekly meetings with our private equity firm. What is your scorecard? How's it going? It is about as fast paced as I've ever been. So you got that piece of it, and I'm telling you, it is about as confrontational as you can possibly get. It makes P&G look like a party.
The Puppy Bowl, maybe?
But on the flip side, one of the companies that I'm working with is a 64-year-old company. They were previously owned by ConAgra, but they were kind of left alone. And so the employees, very familial, most of them have been there for 20, 30 years. And this is like shock treatment. It's a bucket of cold, icy water over their head without them seeing it coming. And so I've really got to help manage both of them. And I have to almost help manage the private equity firm to say, you can't come in here. Right? You got a game to play every Sunday. You can't fire the whole team. You have to help develop these folks and bring them along with you, which was actually one of the key pieces when I transitioned from P&G to Cargill. It really was about persuading, influencing, creating followership when you don't have authority over folks. And so it's, my current role is, in a way, it's challenging because I got to manage 2 cultures and still deliver the business results. So. But the background story I gave you guys is probably pretty good preparation for it.
Yeah, you seem uniquely fitted to that role, and it's really cool that you get to step into that space and learn something new about yourself. Now you're just doing the juggling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
So
cool.
Trying to keep everybody happy.
Not possible usually.
Yeah.
Shoot. Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
So the other question I wanted to ask was around, we're actually launching sort of a mentorship theme in the fall, and I'll talk more about that later. But on that note, I was thinking, since we do know you had 15 years at P&G, 15 years at Cargill, we know you've had a little bit of a career, would love to know what advice you might have for young leaders.
Yeah. Well, a few things I'd throw out there. One is, be planful. What was was it Yogi Berra? If you don't have a plan, you'll be sure to get there. I planned, there's no coincidence that my career kind of went in 5-year chunks. I spent 5 years in sales at P&G, and then I transitioned because I would spend kind of at the 4.5-year mark or even sooner saying, am I where I want to be, or is it time to make a move, either internally. I had 7 jobs at P&G, I had 4 at Cargill. So even though I was at those companies, I moved. So, and part of it was defining where you want to be when you grow up. Now, our generation figured we'd work for 3, maybe 4 companies. Gen Z, which are the, teenagers right now in early college, they're thinking 11 to 12 jobs that they'll have. So maybe it's not a 5-year horizon, but right, it's look at what are you doing every 2 years, every 3 years, and be very planful. That'd be the first thing. The second thing is that as you choose a mentor, instead of having, I guess I'd say, contentless meetings, it has to be a give and a take. So I'll have people that'll meet with me and want to be mentored, and it's kind of a meeting for meeting's sake. The ones that I really love is they say, Paul, I know what your challenges are, I know what you're working on, here's an article, or how can I help you? And I think those will be far more productive if they're one way. I mean, think about it, right? Anything that's one way, eventually, one of the two parties is going to get sick of it. And so be planful, know where you want to be, reconsider it at a regular basis. Mine was every 5 years, maybe it's every 2 or 3. And when you have a mentor relationship, treat it as a 50-50, not a one-way.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, I have to ask one more question, and those of you who've been to a breakfast before, you'll be familiar with it, but Paul, this is a group full of people who like to be helpful. So what can we do to help?
Give us feedback. That's about as simple. Now, obviously, we've done the research, but if it's something that you've heard me say, Paul say, Paul's already blogged about this a couple of times. If you have examples, anecdotes, stories on one way or the other, boy, do I have a story of, badness, to Richard Davis's point, or I have a great story of goodness. We're still in editing mode, and so maybe that's something that we use, or at least at a minimum, it triggers a thought for us. And we don't believe we're the holders of the truth by any means. We're doing it from our experience, and Paul obviously has a huge amount of coaching experience where he's seen this in action. So any input, good or bad, be the skeptic, be the critic, or if you've got something to support, we'll take it from all angles.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for everything this morning. This was so fun. I don't know that I've laughed so hard during a speaker's talk. Your childhood was great.
Yeah. I forgot to mention I played rugby with Chris Farley for 4 years, so it could have gone on forever. So I saved you guys some of those stories. So
next time.
maybe over an Irish green beer.
That sounds perfect. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.